Hello, and thank you for tuning in. Are you a coach interested in coaching at colleges and universities, but have gained most of your experience in industry? Maybe you already have a potential client at an institution and you're unsure what environment exactly you're getting into. And even if you are an experienced higher ed coach or recovering academic like myself, you're sure to find some helpful nuggets and insights that will enhance your practice in this presentation on all things coaching in higher education. So let's get started. My name is Tim Jansa, and I'm a certified leadership and organizational development coach, certified agile coach and agile team facilitator, as well as Wiley Everything DISC certified practitioner. I specialize in building much needed leadership capacity in higher education and transforming institutions of higher learning into great places to work. I've spent most of my career serving colleges and universities in various capacities, both in faculty and staff roles, and I feel privileged to have gained some profound insights into the higher education enterprise by working with and learning from some amazing leaders. On the flip side, I've also experienced the, let's call it, dark side of what can happen when poor leadership is embedded in a system that is often a dinosaur, especially as far as managerial and organizational structures are concerned. So what I'll be sharing here is based on years of observing, living, thriving, and surviving in higher education as a student, faculty member, and staff administrator. So that you know what we'll be covering over the next half hour or so, here are a couple of questions I'll be using to frame my presentation. The first one is, what is it that makes colleges and universities different and somewhat unique organizations that are often puzzling to people from the outside, especially for those who come from industry? A friend and fellow coach asked me not too long ago to help him understand how colleges and universities work as organizations. Watching how his eyes got bigger and bigger while I was trying to explain it to him was fascinating. In the end, it still didn't make a whole lot of sense to him, and I realized just how complex a system we're dealing with. Next, we'll spend a few minutes exploring several challenges specific to the higher education enterprise that are generally not found in other industries. Afterward, we'll discuss coaching specifically in the context of higher education. As you may know, coaching is generally not very well established in higher ed. I believe, though, that it has the potential to be much more impactful than most of the leadership and organizational development mechanisms currently in place at many institutions. While the challenges in higher ed are somewhat different than those in other industries, there is, of course, a lot of overlap with more traditional business or executive coaching in the areas of development addressed here. So to provide some more background, I'll outline a few coaching topics that I've come across over the years that are particularly relevant for colleges and universities. And finally, I'll summarize a couple of key takeaways and provide some areas where we, as coaches in particular, can have a real, tangible, positive, and sustainable impact on a client institution. So how can we transform higher education through coaching, one person at a time, and create some crucial agile structures and mindsets along the way that allow institutions to respond meaningfully to changes rather than react in ways that may end up doing more harm than good? To answer this question, I'll begin with a quick overview, especially for those of you who are not intimately familiar with the higher ed education ecosystem. Before I do that, though, here's an important caveat. There are over 4,000 institutions of higher learning in the United States alone, and each one, just like any organization, is unique in its own way. Many serve their student populations extremely well and are great and meaningful places to work. If you're at one of these institutions, congratulations. Like virtually all organizations, many in higher ed have various pockets of dysfunction and even toxicity. What I'd like to stress, though, is that in college and university settings, even small amounts of a detrimental working culture can have an outsized ripple effect on leaders' ability to create a positive student and employee experience. So what I'm using here is a somewhat generalized view of how a typical college or university may present itself to external advisors and coaches, which also frames and impacts how those advisors might help address the challenges at that institution. Let's imagine for a second you're standing right here. At first glance, you would see the facade of this wonderful university. The impression it makes on you may be that of a clean, established, and smoothly running temple of knowledge and innovation. You see students buzzing around, apparently living their best lives and growing as future leaders, citizens, and change makers. Organizationally, you might expect flat hierarchies and a humming, interconnected knowledge ecosystem. It's a university after all, right? But once you start looking behind the facade, you will slowly begin to see some quirky things that you may not have expected. There's a reason why I asked the AI generator that created this image to use grain silos. The first thing to know is that virtually all institutions of higher learning are built on deeply embedded functional and disciplinary silos, and often silos within silos. For example, we have three major groups of employees, other than student workers, who run things on campus: faculty in charge of teaching and/or research, professional staff with a wide range of responsibilities, well, and then there's what many unfortunately see as the boogeyman, the upper administration. And within each of these groups, you have disciplinary factions. You have people with different ranks, different functions, and at times conflicting priorities. There are layers upon layers of complexity. Unfortunately, members of these groups often don't talk to or speak like each other. There's frequently a lack of mutual appreciation and understanding between faculty, staff, and administrators. I sometimes refer to these groups as castes, like the ones found in traditional Indian social hierarchies. I know caste is a very strong word, but I found it to reflect the realities in many institutions rather accurately. And speaking of hierarchies, what you will likely find is a very strict and deeply ingrained pecking order on campus. This order is based on several factors that include, of course, position, but also degree, academic rank, title, academic discipline, and how much grant funding a faculty member generates, among other more obscure factors. There are, of course, many employees with PhDs and many others with no terminal degrees, which affects the interaction, especially between faculty and professional staff. Even within the faculty, there are those who are tenured or on tenure track versus others who are non-tenure track employees and often focus solely on teaching, have no research agenda, and will never become a full professor down the road. And then you have the group I always like to advocate for, namely professional staff. Unfortunately, at many institutions, they find themselves habitually ignored, sidelined, even actively silenced, and not included in making any decisions that affect them first and foremost. To many, they seem to only exist to make things happen and to do the necessary work to keep the campus running. Now, this may sound harsh, but unfortunately, it's the reality, and also an area where there is tremendous potential for development. As a result of these dynamics, you're looking at a wide range of priorities and levels of influence that differ significantly between silos and subgroups. At some institutions, governance structures give faculty quite a bit of say and leverage, which then often pits them against the administration. In other institutions, faculty have little say. Either way, most faculty members will be more interested in their research, teaching, and other academic pursuits. The administration, on the other hand, is mainly concerned with strategy, the business of running a college or university, attracting funding, resource allocation, stakeholder relations, management, and maintaining the institution's public image. By now, I'm sure you see how these groups' priorities just don't seem to align, and sometimes they clash openly. And when you add to this that members of each group often have little knowledge of or interest in the lived experiences of the other and tend to dismiss each other's contributions to the organization as, for instance, short-sighted, too academic, too political, too money-focused, too self-serving, or too mundane, well, conflict is almost inevitable. You might wonder, why is this? Why are large groups of employees so at odds with each other? Isn't everybody just trying to do what's best for their students? The sad reality is that there's often a lack of a unified and shared vision for the institution because each of these groups has its own agenda and views differently what is important in the grand scheme of things. There are also vastly different success criteria for different types of employees. Think about what outcomes and KPIs drive the evaluation, promotion, and daily work of faculty on the one hand and professional staff on the other. Then compare these to upper administrators who look at their institution from a proverbial 30,000-foot vantage point. And speaking of the economics of running a college or university, here's a fact that hardly anybody ever talks about. There is really no traditional business model that fits higher education, no matter how much the administration, the president and her or his cabinet, the board of regents and legislators see the institution as a business. This is certainly completely different and separate discussion, But humor me for a second. Let me ask a simple question to illustrate this, one that I've written about at length in my work on agile transformation and higher education. And the question is, what is it that an institution of higher learning actually produces? What is the product? Some may say it's education, whatever that means exactly. Or is it research and publications? Or maybe it's contributing to the economy and building the future workforce in their communities. Perhaps it's all of the above. If you ask a professor, for instance, the answer may well depend on whether they're on the teaching or research track in their specific discipline, such as STEM, the humanities, the arts, business, etc. And if you ask a staff member, then educational or research outcomes may not be top of mind at all. Their concerns probably revolve more around the administrative or physical work they do: HR, business services, departmental administration, maintenance, serving food, or keeping the transportation infrastructure clean and running. Intertwined with what matters to whom on campus are questions of funding, at times highly problematic financial allocation models, and resource scarcity, whether real or perceived. When achieving what matters requires money and people believe there's little to go around, fighting over limited resources can get vicious. Also, as part of the academic enterprise, there's often already a lot of competition amongst faculty researchers and their respective departments. Some institutions, depending on how they are led, actually foster and stoke competition across all units and division on campus to see who comes out on top, and then decides who gets what size of the funding pie. This certainly may work in industry, but I have yet to see a case where this approach is useful in education. So, what's the result of all this? Well, you end up with convoluted organizational structures, reporting lines, decision-making processes, and political wranglings that are often entirely nonsensical for outsiders, and also present obstacles to organizational adaptation, innovation, and the institution's capacity to respond to a constantly changing social, political, and technological landscape. In the end, what this means is that higher education institutions are often extremely slow to enact meaningful and sustainable change. For instance, I'm puzzled by the fact that many institutions still engage in creating 10-year strategic plans that may take a year or so to write before they even launch. In this day and age, 10 years might as well be a century. Just think about how the rise of artificial intelligence since the release of ChatGPT in the fall of 2023 has completely uprooted how we work, how we acquire and digest knowledge, how we find and apply for jobs, and how we decide on what skills to build so we can be prepared for the future. Or how in the late 1990s the internet changed everything. In the 2020s and beyond, leaders simply cannot anticipate what's going to happen even 2 or 3 years from now, let alone 10. So why don't institutions just switch to creating more agile short-term plans? Well, there are many reasons, some real, some imagined, some having more to do with ego and individual legacy than setting the stage for long-term institutional success. But aside from leaders' desire to counter increasing uncertainty by sticking with the devil you know and replicating what has arguably worked in the past, there are also deeply ingrained, truly ossified organizational and leadership structures that do little but stifle innovation, especially administratively. What few talk about is that this single-minded urge to keep this titan of an ocean liner afloat on a somewhat dubious course set years ago tends to affect the most vulnerable employees on campus more than anyone else. I'm talking about the people on the front lines, non-academic staff, faculty teaching intro-level courses, service professionals in departments and support units who directly interact with and arguably have an outsized impact on students. In short, these are the people who sit where the proverbial rubber meets the road and experience the subtle shifts in student needs and expectations over the years firsthand. If you ask me, these liminal spaces on the front lines of institutional operations are precisely where meaningful and impactful transformation work needs to be done, and perhaps ought to be tackled first. The challenge for us coaching professionals is that these complexities, this ambiguity, and these hierarchies demand a lot of acceptance on our part, acuity in navigating this landscape, and a willingness at times to just go with the flow. So again, imagine yourself right here, slowly gaining more and more awareness of what's behind the facade of this institution and learning to appreciate its many layers of complexity. Now that we set the stage, let's talk about some of the challenges that are somewhat unique to higher education. The first challenge is actually a function of two fundamental fallacies. In academia, individual and group identities, rather than a unified vision, mission, or goal, drive many decisions and strategies. And these identities, as I mentioned, are often based on rank, title, function, degree, and professional or academic discipline. One consequence of this is that it ties leadership, or rather the claim to leadership, exclusively to positionality. Some may think, for example, that because they have been in an administrative role with an impressive title, perhaps salary, at one institution, they now feel entitled to being seen and respected as a leader once they transition to a new campus, even though they have only a very limited understanding of their new institution and its employees, students, processes, and culture. What I have observed more frequently, though, is that someone who has earned a PhD and may now be a full professor feels entitled to a leadership position as chair, associate dean, or dean, while they also believe that their academic and professional experience has sufficiently prepared them for this role. I call this scenario the faculty leadership trap. It can make working with faculty a real challenge. By the way, please know that I do not mean to pass judgment on anybody with this statement. The issue is simply how many faculty, especially those on tenure track, are trained. Think about it. Throughout their career, it's been about their dissertation, their PhD, their research, their publications, their conference presentations, and competing with others for their promotion, tenure, and grant funding. In other words, the system forces them to focus largely on themselves. If one of these individuals is then elevated, for example, to become a chair or a director of a department or center, they tend to be ill-prepared for the job. They just don't know how to lead because up until now, their career has been largely about themselves. And when you then pair this misconception and overestimation of leadership skills with existing top-down command and control structures and an institutional culture that is often more concerned with maintaining the status quo, suppressing disruption, or cementing existing power dynamics than embracing and enacting innovation, you have another potential issue. Because those already in power decide who is worthy of or entitled to future development, again, based on title, rank, degree, discipline, function, etc. Those employees who are already marginalized, in particular professional and hourly staff who generally don't possess higher degrees, or adjunct faculty who teach the vast majority of intro-level courses, they never stand a chance to advance or grow beyond their current position or have a tangible or purposeful impact on the future of their institution. And here's another inconvenient but important truth. Because higher ed leaders' sense of identity is so tightly interwoven with power dynamics, hierarchies, and positionality, faculty and staff who may demonstrate competence, knowledge, and skill beyond that of the leader, who question the way things are and refuse to buy into accept the dogma, or more often than not, seen as a threat and may find themselves ghosted or actively sidelined. Needless to say, the kind of innovative momentum these people could potentially bring simply evaporates. In the end, the glacial speed at which change already happens in higher education becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And whatever or whoever is needed to make the institution more agile and responsive to change never gets asked to step up. And many of the affected staff and faculty members simply end up leaving the campus and taking all the institutional knowledge they have accumulated over many years with them. The second fallacy I've come across again and again is the misconception that our colleges and universities are de facto machines, instead of the complex, adaptive, human-driven ecosystems they really are. In this day and age, it's hard to imagine why leaders would still embrace a viewpoint that's rooted in the age of scientific management of the early 20th century, when the worth of an employee was determined by their limited function and their ability to do rote and repetitive tasks quickly and error-free. But when you think about this question in the context of higher education, it actually makes sense. There is a fascinating confluence of two overlapping and mutually reinforcing mindsets that many leaders, especially those who have emerged from the faculty, are intimately familiar with. First, there is this deeply ingrained structured and logic-based criticality that drives faculty researchers to always question, always analyze, and always strive to find the weak link in an argument process or system. The foundational assumption here is that there must be a rational answer and solution to every problem. Irrational causes driven by emotion, aspirations, or fear have no place and are irrelevant. The second mindset is one that any administrator in today's neoliberal university, Inc., knows all too well. Education is a business. There is a bottom line, And there are quantitative metrics that determine and govern everything the institution and the people who work there do. The assumption here is that if something can't be measured and expressed in numbers, it doesn't matter. Unfortunately, not only is education itself not measurable in quantitative terms, the result of this way of thinking is also that many leaders tend to forget about or at least discount what or rather who lies at the heart of their institution, and that's people. And people are by nature often irrational, have a multitude of lived experiences, preferences, perspectives, and aspirations, and forge interpersonal relationships with one another across the organization that, in a crisis, may prove stronger than established processes or rules. So when you put these two mindsets together, it is no wonder that for so many higher ed leaders, structure, process, and an individual's function are still much more important than relationships and those many intangibles of a living, breathing human ecosystem. In the end, for many, it's much easier to adopt the view of a system as a sort of machine where cause and effect are easily determined and problems can be fixed. Now, thinking of organizations as machines brings us to the next challenge. If our institutions can, in fact, be fixed by, say, simply replacing a squeaky wheel in the form of an employee who doesn't fall in line and wants to innovate, then leadership in a contemporary 21st century sense is much less important than functional authority and expertise. Unfortunately, decades of this type of thinking have led to widespread absence of meaningful and sustained leadership development across our colleges and universities. Remember, title, degree, and rank often determine someone's suitability as a leader, rather than proven relational skills and the ability to influence others to achieve a common goal, mission, or vision. So why spend precious resources on building leadership skills and capacity and create a pipeline of skilled and respected future leaders? As I stressed at the beginning, some institutions have fantastic programs that foster leadership among employees of different ranks, titles, and functions holistically, strategically, and long-term across campus. In short, they do a fantastic job taking care of their people. But let's be honest, the vast majority of leadership development programs are one-offs, generally run as part of a short-lived HR initiative or accreditation scheme. These are often short-term trainings or workshops with little to no follow-up. In the end, many of these programs are simply ineffective and exist only to check boxes. And those programs that actually do build some form of mentionable leadership capacity are often rooted in outdated concepts of leadership. Because leadership, as we've seen, is a function of positionality, command and control, and maintaining the air of competence. And when those who have worked their way up through an already broken system select and train the next generation, chances are that those burgeoning new leaders won't be doing things much differently than those who came before them. I asked the question earlier what product higher education institutions actually generate. Now, this is perhaps a good time to talk about how higher ed's traditional core missions often clash with the pressures and expectations of politicians, industry, and society at large. Traditionally, the purpose of colleges and universities was teaching and learning, as well as research and scholarship. And then a little later came the whole idea of service to society. What has been dominating for years now, however, is that many today see the purpose and usefulness of tertiary education through the lens of a fourth mission, and that is economic development and, in my opinion, a somewhat myopic and single-minded focus on preparing students for future careers. Instead of providing learners with opportunities to explore and discover unfamiliar ways of knowing, being, and expressing themselves as a member of a global society, which is what institutes of higher learning were designed to do. What drives much of the debate over higher education these days is, again, a conflict between different stakeholder priorities and expectations. You have students and their families, faculty, administrators, staff, the community at large, industry representatives, and politicians, each with their own set of goals and outcomes. And then add to the mix tremendous financial strain on institutions and their students, funding pressures, and resource scarcity. The reason I'm mentioning this is that service providers, especially coaches and other external advisors who engage with higher ed institutions, will likely encounter a wide range of emotions, opinions, and perceptions around funding and resources. This discourse is part of the DNA of virtually all institutions, so not mentioning this challenging aspect here will be truly remiss on my end. Given all this, the second to last challenge may come as no surprise. Higher education used to be, and to some extent still is, a fascinating and uniquely diverse field to work in. But employer priorities, especially since COVID, have changed tremendously. Where people used to be content being part of and playing a small part in a larger mission driven enterprise with great public recognition, they now demand greater autonomy and purpose. They want opportunities to work from home and find more meaning in their jobs. They want a deeper connection to what they do. They want to find deeper fulfillment and avenues to learn, grow, and advance. This shift is partially driven by post pandemic changes in how society perceives work in general. But another part is a generational and overall demographic shift. Younger people expect different forms of engagement with their colleagues, employers, and work overall. They crave flatter hierarchies, more flexible project based assignments, and more say in how they design their careers. As you can imagine, many colleges and universities are currently not equipped or, frankly, even willing to create the kinds of environments that both younger and more established employees now demand. Now, granted, some of these demands are over the top and would make it impossible to maintain a professional atmosphere where work actually gets done efficiently and on time. But unless institutions adapt to employees' expectations of what makes a desirable working environment, the trend of higher and higher turnover and more people leaving higher ed, either to advance or to seek greener pastures and find more meaning in what they do, will continue and probably only get worse. And this brings me to the final challenge. As you can see, higher ed is rife with both massive systemic obstacles and tremendous opportunities. There is a hurdle, though, that's tough to overcome for many of us in the coaching profession. You see, at the lower to middle level of most institutions, and here we're talking about academic departments, service units, and college level offices, coaching is generally still viewed as a punitive intervention mechanism for employees in trouble. I've been leading a bench of amazing professionals who coach at a large research university in the Midwest. In that capacity, I regularly talk to the folks who oversee the coaching programs on site. Earlier this year, I asked what they are hearing from clients, and they noted that participating faculty and staff leaders are often hesitant to talk about their experience as coaching clients. What has come to light is that many of them still think that they're only in this program because they're somewhat and somehow in trouble. What they don't see, and what perhaps is not being communicated sufficiently, is something that most higher level administrators have known for a long time. Namely, that coaching is actually a tremendous benefit, a reward of sorts, and an investment in developing an employee's potential so that they can become even more proficient, respected, and effective in their role. Unfortunately, this message, by and large, has not yet arrived where it arguably could have the greatest impact. And all this directly impacts coaches who work predominantly with faculty and may not have faculty experience or advanced degrees themselves. Not only may their clients already feel defensive about being selected for coaching, but it is also helpful to remember that due to academic competition, these leaders may have experienced little psychological safety in their careers. Coaches may therefore encounter an initial lack of trust and a client's willingness or ability to open up, to be honest with and about themselves, and be receptive to the kind of service the coach provides. So there may be some extra work that needs to be done before higher ed coaches can really get to work with their clients. In any event, I hope going over these challenges gives you a better idea of the multi-level complexities we're facing when we're talking about coaching in higher education. We briefly touched on this earlier, so let's answer the question of why we should care about coaching in higher education at all. I mentioned before that coaching can have potentially an oversized positive impact on colleges and universities as organizations and places where employees feel valued and supported. Unlike traditional approaches to leadership development and organizational transformation in this industry, which includes consulting, by the way, coaching has shown to cut through so many of the barriers that tend to keep transformational change from happening, as long as it's properly socialized across campus, as we have seen. We already discussed how professional identity and positionality determine someone's claim to, and their sometimes overinflated self-perception of leadership competence due to, for instance, academic achievement or degree attainment. In this environment, external advisors, especially those without a strong academic background, often come in guns blazing with a catalog of suggestions and strategies and then expect leaders to simply accept and implement these recommendations. Needless to say, they're fighting an uphill battle in their attempt to effect change. Without knowing it, they actually undermine a leader's sense of being in the know, being competent in what they do, and being in control, which in effect attacks their identity as a leader. This is a dynamic many advisors and consultants are blissfully unaware of, until they wonder why their work has only a negligible effect or is rejected right off the bat. What this boils down to is that most directive approaches and quick fixes just don't work, because on the surface at least, they do little more than undermine employees' identities and question their competence. The second reason why I believe coaching is the most effective way to bring lasting positive change in higher education is, as we have seen, the sheer level of organizational complexity. When you wish to transform a system where the psychology of potential changemakers is just as important to consider as processes and chains of command, you need a long, or at least longer-term, non-directive approach to nudge the system in the desired direction. And the way you achieve this is one person, or perhaps one team at a time, and by helping our clients achieve personal and professional goals that also align with their units, their colleges, or their institution's priorities. It's important to achieve such an alignment if we wish to gradually affect institutions as a whole. This, of course, takes time and a strategic investment and a careful calibration of setting goals during the discovery phase of any engagement. When done right, though, coaching can quickly address a core challenge for many colleges and universities today: employee turnover and attrition. Remember, the more complex an organization, the more important it is to keep those employees who have the most knowledge about how the place actually works. And despite what many administrators believe, that expertise lies not with the members of the president's cabinet, but often with those poorly compensated folks in the departments and campus support offices. They not only know how to get stuff done, they're also the ones with their finger on the pulse of the institution. Coaching here is not just a powerful tool, but the right tool if you wish to counter staff and faculty turnover, because it allows for strategic development through pathways for advancement, developing the next generation of leaders with deep knowledge, and leveraging those people's appreciation for the idiosyncrasies of their institution. The last point I'd like to make here perhaps seems a little silly, but given how professional identities on campus work, it's worth stressing that coaching is not consulting. Consulting, by and large, has a really bad rap in higher education for the very reasons I outlined a few minutes ago when I spoke of why directive approaches often don't work or simply miss the mark. I also mentioned earlier that traditional business models often don't or only partially apply to higher ed institutions. So when a consulting firm is brought in, often for a staggering amount of money, mind you, their approach, as proven as it may be in the private sector, will likely fall short of expectations. I once watched this unfold firsthand as a member of the university staff Senate Budget Committee when my university brought in a large and well-known firm to conduct a campus-wide compensation study and recommend changes to the pay structure for both academic and non-academic employees. Now, I will spare you the details of what all went wrong, but let me say that in the end, it took almost a year instead of the promised 2 months or so to get the findings, and then, well, the university had simply moved on with business as usual. This is just one example of many out there where institutions invest enormous amounts of money in initiatives that look great on paper and help top-level leaders convince stakeholders that they know how to fix their campus. But what they often don't understand is that faculty and staff members who often paid a pittance for doing the foundational work of the college are also told that austerity measures are to blame for, say, the past 5 years without a pay raise. Again, I'm not saying that both can't be true simultaneously and that consulting in general is useless. But unless the consultants understand the higher ed ecosystem and leaders carefully manage the messaging around that work, traditional consultancies are seen by many on campus as a complete waste of precious resources. And to be honest, I share that sentiment. But that's precisely where coaching can come in as a powerful and impactful tool that can make a real difference without breaking the bank. Because we help create change makers and multipliers that eventually have a snowball effect on the entire system. We're slowly getting to the end, so thank you for your time and attention thus far. To start wrapping things up, let's discuss a few topics that drive the work of higher education coaches, but will also resonate with those more familiar with traditional business coaching. The first one here is building the knowledge, skills, and capacity for what is, in effect, contemporary leadership. What this is exactly needs to be the topic for a different discussion. But let's just say I believe that Aaron Dignan of the consulting firm The Ready summarized it best in his 2019 book, Brave New Work, where he outlined two pillars, mindsets really, that drive today's evolutionary organizations. Being, as he coined it, complexity conscious and people positive. In other words, it's being aware of an organization not as a machine, but as a complex, adaptive, living, breathing organism, and embracing the belief that people not only want to contribute in a meaningful and purposeful way by doing the best work they possibly can, but that they also want to continue to grow, learn, and thrive. Building capacity in leaders to embrace that way of thinking is what we as coaches are particularly well positioned to do. The second topic is driving, creating, and leading change, and knowing the difference between those three. One thing I've come to believe, and something that is guiding my work as a coach and advisor, is that institutional leaders should drive the change, but allow it to be created from the bottom up at different places and levels in the organization with various formal and informal leaders. Helping administrators devise strategies for change and identifying critical change makers is a great topic for coaching, because it requires them to question and reflect on their perception of how the institution actually works. And the more insight our clients gain, the better they are positioned to make a difference. Then, of course, there's helping clients, especially those who have come into higher education from the outside, to understand their place in this environment, in the ambiguities that often surround the role within the higher ed ecosystem. This transition can be very challenging, especially from someone from an organization where duties, reporting lines, responsibilities, and outcomes are clearly defined. Now, they may find themselves perhaps confused by what their exact role is, who's responsible for what, and accountable to whom, and how to navigate a range of, at times, conflicting expectations. We have already talked about the topic of academic leaders managing professional staff, where the former may have advanced degrees and may be accomplished researchers, while the latter don't and aren't. There are, of course, also some preconceived notions of staff about faculty and vice versa that are often not very positive and only reinforce the big gaps in terms of mutual appreciation and understanding. So, coaching clients to find their place in the institutional ecosystem and learning how best to relate to those who either rely on them or on whom they rely is a common theme, especially for mid-level leaders. Before we get to the last section, let me briefly name a few additional topics. First, there is building innovative capacity amongst various campus communities and creating agile organizational and leadership structures, as well as resilient cultures. Then there's strategic and succession planning, where you want to create structures that embrace agility, flexibility, and responsiveness to changing environments and priorities, rather than blindly following or even hiding behind a 10-year strategic plan. And this includes identifying and fostering talent in ways that go way beyond your traditional 9-box grid. Next, there's the issue of managing both up and down across the complex environments of our colleges and universities. And finally, one super important cluster of challenges that really deserves its own discussion is mergers, acquisitions, and both academic and administrative reorganizations. There is a lot of potential, but also a lot of danger in these undertakings. And a skilled coach can have a significant positive impact on how these go for everybody involved. Reorganizations in particular can be a wonderful opportunity to bring the community together, but they can also be treacherous and extremely disruptive and can have massive and long-lasting negative effects if not done properly, which is something I have experienced firsthand. To wrap up this presentation, I'd like to leave you with a few key takeaways that I hope encompass most of what we discussed here. I would also like to issue a call to action or two that can help to get some meaningful transformation started. First, I explained how higher ed institutions are often very slow to respond to and enact meaningful and sustainable change. Our job as coaches is to help them become more agile and to activate and leverage the tremendous potential and knowledge, skills, and expertise that is already embedded in their organization. One visible leadership behavior, for instance, is that institutional leaders informally seek out and genuinely ask questions of staff members in departments and frontline service units so that they can better understand what is happening on the ground, how decisions from higher up are being perceived, and what students are saying. On a side note, this of course requires humility on the leader's side and a high level of psychological safety amongst the staff, and both are somewhat uncommon. If neither exist, then working on slowly shifting the culture of communication, collaboration, and empowerment may need to be the first step. I invite you to help clients see that there is so much knowledge and innovative potential across the board and help them appreciate who really knows how things work, don't work, and how to improve them. Next, I invite you to help leaders understand their institutions not as machines that can be fixed or forced to bend to a leader's will, but as complex adaptive organizational ecosystems that need to be nudged in the desired direction. Now, don't get me wrong, you can, of course, force a system to bend by decree, but the chances of that change lasting or being accepted long term are slim to none. And finally, let's find ways to dispel the image of coaching as a punitive intervention for employees in trouble. Coaching is a boon, a valuable benefit, something that sets clients up for long-term success by investing in and further developing their skills. I'd like to close by repeating that higher education has tremendous potential and a surprising plethora of opportunities for coaches to make a real difference. It's not an easy space to be in. Working with and within higher ed requires at least some foundational knowledge and appreciation for how colleges and universities work and where many of the most pressing pain points can be found. In the end, we as coaches can affect not only how these organizations are run, but also how they educate their students and serve society at large. In fact, I'm convinced that we can help institutions model what a modern people-centered workplace that embraces and values diversity and complexity can be. One that brings together and empowers a wide range of stakeholders on campus, irrespective of rank and title. And one that leverages this diversity and draws on the knowledge, wisdom, and experience and expertise amongst its employees. I'm an educator at heart, and maybe too much of an idealist, and perhaps naive in many ways. But I've found that working in higher ed as a coach is truly meaningful. I hope I've convinced you of the tremendous impact coaching can have on the long-term well-being of institutions and the people who work there. We do all this and more by meeting our clients where they are, starting a journey of discovery and change with them from there, being present and supporting them along the way, and helping them to create better futures for themselves and their institutions. Thanks for watching.